All right, fans. Thank you so much. Welcome back. We have our next panel with our G1 writers. Let's give it up for Buzz Dixon, Donald F. Glut, Michael Charles Hill, and Flint Dille. So this is a Q&A panel. You get to ask your questions, but as always, we're going to start to our guests. We'd love to hear how you got started in your career and what brought you to Transformers. Yeah, take it away. Wherever you want to start.
Well, as I just said, I became a professional writer because I'm unemployable in all other fields. This is not a recommended career strategy, by the way. As far as Transformers go, long before the Transformers started, there was a toy called the Shogun Warriors. And when that came out, I was working at Filmation Studios, and I tried to convince Lou Scheimer, get the rights to this because giant robots are huge in Japan, and once they catch on here, they're going to be just as big. And, Lou blew me off. And I ended up going to Ruby Spears' studio, and I kept pushing for giant robot stories, and they kept saying, yeah, right, and again, blew me off. Then one day, the Hasbro guys came in with a suitcase full of Transformer toys, and they showed them to us, and they said, we want to make a cartoon series based on this, and we want to know if Ruby Spears is interested in partnering with us in doing this show. And after their presentation, after they left, I was going like, all the time. I told Joe Ruby, I said, Joe, you have got to get this. This is going to be huge. This is going to be giant. You've got to get involved in this. And Joe went, nah, I got a better idea. We're going to do a story about a teenage boy who turns into a car. And that was Turbo Teen. And I've told the story of Turbo Teen too many times, and I won't take away from Don. So go over to Don.
It's kind of a long story. I'll try to make it as short as possible. I was, back in the late 1960s, I was playing bass guitar in a rock band called the Penny Arcade that was produced by Mike Nesmith of the Monkees. And when the Monkees got canceled, Mike couldn't afford us anymore, so I desperately had to try to find a different kind of work. I didn't want to have a regular job. That was the last thing on my list, having a regular job. And luckily I had various abilities to do various creative things that came easy to me. And I tried acting. I did a television commercial. I did some extra work in movies. And then I stumbled into writing for the monster movie magazines, and that kind of led to writing Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine and the Jim Moore and Creepy Eerie and Vampirella, and that led to working for Marvel Comics and Gold Key and DC and whatever. When Jim Shooter came in as editor-in-chief at Marvel, a lot of us on the West Coast who were working for Marvel Comics got canned, and we desperately had to find some other kind of work. And luckily the animation business was out here, which we found easy to work in that business because we were trained to think visually. Comic books were visual, and so we could write and draw episodes that weren't just a bunch of talking heads. And I was at Hanna-Barbera writing scripts for a story editor named Bryce Malick, who I became friends with. And then Bryce came over to Marvel Production. Was it Marvel Production that we did?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Transformers. And he called me one day and he said, Don, you want to write some Transformers scripts? I said, sure. What are they about? And he says, I'm not really sure what they're about. They're about giant robots fighting and stuff. And I was a big fan of the Japanese monster movies. So I just translated what I remembered from the Godzilla, then Ultraman and all this into these Transformers, and that's how it happened in the short end of the story, the short version of the story. Then I wrote 12 episodes, and here I am today.
Okay. For me, it was I was working in film production. and writing freelance live-action movie scripts. And at some point, Flint and I became friends. We had a writers group. We'd meet every Monday night. And at some point, after he had met Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, he called me up and said, how'd you like to get paid for writing? So I ended up writing on a Ruby Spears show called Dragon's Lair. And I wrote 4 of the 13 episodes that we did. And I decided I really liked not getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and have to be on set or location at 6. And it was relatively good money at the time. It got better shortly thereafter. So after I was done with the Ruby Spears, I started talking to other animation studios and picking up some freelance work. And then I met Bryce Malick when Marvel was still doing the Transformer shows, and got a freelance assignment. Had no idea what I was doing. I didn't understand the Transformers at all. And then I think probably about a month after I finished that, I ended up on staff at Sunbow, working on both Transformers and G.I. Joe. And the rest is history.
I get, I can tell this story in which each of these people sort of plays some kind of a part in it, and how I got there. And that is, I got out of college, went to Berkeley as an undergraduate, graduate, no idea what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. I have a degree in ancient history, which becomes relevant later. But ancient history wasn't really the job one. You didn't get slam tackled by recruiters when you had an ancient history degree. Anyway, so first person here that I met was Mike Hill. I met you through Tony Cincinnati, who is we were in our Hollywood guerrilla period, and I don't know whether I was at SC or not yet. So, but Don Glut figures into it. Okay, Don Glut was always the Dinobot guy, okay, when I got to Transformers. He was one of the few guys that went from season 1 to, all the way through the series, because he understood characters that I probably understood the least. What I did not know, and if you watch this documentary about John Milius, the guy that wrote Apocalypse Now and Dirty Harry and my hero screenwriter, was that Don Glut had been in that same class. He was in the class at USC that George Lucas and Randy Kleiser and John Milius and Don Glut, and they actually made movies about him. I didn't know that until I saw him, for 40 years I had no idea until that. And I grew up reading Creepy and Eerie, which was like, probably more than I read actual comic. I mean, I read actual comic books, but unlike everybody, anyway. So yeah, so you get to that part of it. So that's Mike and let's see. Well, Buzz, I meet the first day I'm at Ruby Spears. I slither in there. Originally meet him because my family owns the prop rights to this thing called Buck Rogers. It was a comic strip in the 40s. It was a TV show too, and they were just making the TV show, so I come down to Hollywood thinking, we licensed them the rights. They'll be really happy to have me on the set. And I found out the world doesn't work that way, and they don't want the licensor's kid running around on the set. So that was a big net. But I somehow ended up in USC Film School, where I'm still a professor, but on the side, but. And so the first day I'm at Ruby Spears, Joe Ruby takes me out to lunch with Buzz, which is a really irresponsible thing for Joe to do, because I'm assuming this is like the role model I'm supposed to follow, which, if you recall, led to almost instant firing. What was it? We kept, we had this future computer thing where you had dinosaur computer chips. I don't remember who it was, but remember that? It was a Cyberforce was the name of it. Not to be confused with the real show called Cyberforce, but this was some crap Buzz and I were developing. We thought we'd had the most brilliant take on any show ever done for any reason. And Joe didn't share our enthusiasm, and I didn't know at that point. I learned, but I didn't know you're not supposed to argue about it. So, I said, Joe, come on, anyway, that was dumb. And I was on a 2-week contract, and I'm sure I was going to be flushed. Anyway, but things worked out very well at Ruby Spears. I mean, Buzz, Steve Gerber, Marty Pasco taught me how to write, animation scripts. Because I was at SC Film School, and I got my master's degree and all that. But they don't have a class in writing animation. They do now, okay? But then they didn't. And Joe hired me for development. Nobody bothered to tell me what development was, and I would spend most of the rest of my film career in development hell, but I didn't know about that yet. Anyway, so things went very well at Ruby Spears, and it was Mr. T. You wrote episodes for that too, didn't you, Buzz? Yeah. Mr. T.
I made more off the one Mr. T live action than I ever made off of any other script in animation.
Well, and I officially was able to join the Writers Guild from Mr. T, because they had these wraparounds, okay, where Mr. T talked for about 4 seconds, but nevertheless, you were treated like, union-wise, like it was a half-hour sitcom. Okay, and so we're just racking up I couldn't understand why everybody wanted to write my live action, but I think Joe protected me at one point when one of our less honorable co-writers was trying to write the live action. And then a lot of things got lucky. Did Paul Dini show up in here? Paul, you here? We wanted him to come. He could have honorarily been a member of the panel. Anyway, then Paul Dini and I got hired to work at Lucasfilm. And they were doing Star Wars for Saturday morning, which may have been a misbegotten idea. Just kind of the nature of our personalities. I ended up on a show called Droids, and Paul ended up on a show called Ewoks. And the truth is, the only characters I really created that are part of canon are Princess and King Gornish, who are Ewok characters, but nevertheless. Paul did very well there, did the series, stuck in there. I had a short, ugly experience on that, was gone. There was kind of an interesting payoff to the story much later on. But, and so I'm back in LA thinking my career's over, and I'm doing dinner theater in Scottsdale, and, I'm going to be working on Turbo Teen for the rest of my life. And vowed never to do robots again. So Steve Gerber calls me up and says, hey, I'm doing this show. That he was the story editor on G.I. Joe, and he said, but in G.I. Joe, you can hit people with the real fists. Okay, that was his pitch. And I said, we're doing G.I. Joe and Transformers. I'm in for G.I. Joe, never doing robots again. Went in to do G.I. Joe, and it was just the easiest, most effortless, natural writing job I've ever had. Just was totally tuned to my nervous system. However, about 6 months in, Joe and Tom then decided to hire me as a producer. And their pitch was, we named a character after you, so you have to take the job. Now, that's probably not true, but, I'll print the legend. But the point is that, so I'm now a producer there. And, Joe and Tom both show up in town and said, look, I know what you said about never doing robots again, but we need to move over to Transformers and kind of give it that sort of edge that G.I. Joe has. And I said, I don't know anything about Transformers. They don't do robots. Well, cut to that argument fell apart. And next thing I knew, I was working on Transformers. So that's how I got to Transformers. And after vowing never to do robots again. And I should have maybe stuck to it, but nevertheless, that was the circumstances on which I arrived. Sorry, that was a really long-winded answer, but what's interesting is all these people are one way or another connected, and were kind of before all this started.
Before we go on, I just want to say, Joe Ruby had the patience of Job, because I would have fired myself 12 times during my career.
I think he tried to fire you 12 times.
I think so, yeah.
But it didn't take. No, was that Jack who he fired?
Yeah, we had a writer who, when there's in animation writing, there was a period called hiatus, and that was when the old shows finished production, but the new shows hadn't been purchased yet. And they typically laid off many people on the staff. They would try to keep key people on to do development for the next season, but most people they would let go.
It was kind of hiatus is what it was.
Yeah. And they told one of the writers there, well, we're going on hiatus, and if you find work elsewhere, please go right ahead and take it. We won't feel offended if you get a job elsewhere. And he said, well, when are you coming back? And they said, well, in April, but if you find a job before April, by all means take it. I mean, don't wait for us. So, you know, he leaves, and 4 months later, April 1st, he shows up, sits down at his old desk, and nobody had the nerve to tell him he wasn't hired back, so he just got hired back by default.
Which tells you a lot about the world that created this, because, you know, I mean, Joe Ruby was one of the nicest guys in the world. He was also really smart. He and his partner created Scooby-Doo, which is how they got their own studio. You know, and like, you know, Scooby-Doo is still around. Like, my kids watch Scooby-Doo, you know, movies. They did when they were kids, not anymore. But, you know, and so anything that would reflect badly on Joe in this conversation, his primary liability was that, you know, he didn't fire Buzz or me 12 times. And, you know, and I remember Steve Gerber once saying, you know, the studio went downhill when Joe stopped listening to Buzz's third idea. Because Buzz would come out with 2 ideas that were really appalling, or, you know, well, I mean, he never came out with like an average idea, right? And then the third one would be absolutely brilliant. If you listened for that, it's probably still that way. If you listened for that, you know, then it was gold and you made shows. Because Turbo Teen actually sold and they actually made it.
Yeah.
Right. You know, and, you know, I mean, that was, but yeah, that was,
Joe took me off.
Ruby Spears is really relevant to, just real quickly, to Transformers, because it was the thinly disguised ex-Ruby Spears writing team that did that, you know, that was Sunbow.
Yeah. Real quick thing on Turbo Teen. I lasted 15 minutes on that show because Joe gave us the Bible for it, told us to come up with story ideas, and I got about halfway through the Bible, threw it away, went back to Joe's office and said, Joe, I'll work on the show if you can explain a few things to me. If the kid turns into a car and they take the tires off, when he turns back into a kid, is he missing his hands and feet? If he turns into a car and they take the battery out, if he turns back into a kid, is he missing his heart? If he turns into a car and they put a suitcase in his trunk, and Joe said, I am putting you on another show.
And the truth is, if the answer had been he didn't have a heart or feet or legs or stuff like that, it probably would have been a hit and there would have been no Transformers. But, you know, yeah, we didn't go that way. And Saturday Morning didn't go that way.